Albert Einstein once said that all religions, arts, and sciences are branches of the same tree. As today's technology and global risks race ahead of our understanding and stretch the boundaries of humanity, we face unprecedented ethical conundrums. I believe that reaching beyond the sciences and religion to that third branch, the arts, offers essential insight into these challenges. I call ethical decision-making on the borders of humanity ethics on the edge. We all teeter on the edge. How do we define a life well lived in a partly virtual world? Where do we look for moral guidelines and truth when curated selves befriend each other through algorithms? How do we make conscionable decisions in the uncharted territory of civilian space travel, designer genetics, and artificial intelligence? And what about the problems that are still on the ethical edge but shouldn't be, such as inequality or racism? Please join me in conversation with some of the world's leading artists and arts world pioneers as we explore some of today's most challenging ethical questions through the lens of the visual and performing arts, architecture, and literature. Paul, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here, and as you know, I'm a great fan of the RCA. To start, why don't we just maybe hear from you a little bit about generally the mission and vision of the RCA at this point in its history, and in particular, congratulations, I believe, are in order for yet again the #1 worldwide slot in arts and design on the QS rankings.
Thank you.
So maybe a little bit about what you think accounts for your success. Before we get into these questions of the day about the arts and how the arts relate to the major ethical questions of our time.
I think age has something to do with it. I'm not saying that you have to be old to be excellent, but I think a few decades behind you helps perfect, smooth out wrinkles, and understand the way that works and things that perhaps work less well. I think the kind of individual tuition model at the RCA is very core and fundamental to the way we work. The idea that you have a kind of a one-to-one relationship with a tutor, whether you're an artist or whether you're a designer or whether you're an architect. I think peer learning is essential. I mean, people learn a lot from a Meister, but they also learn a huge amount from their peer group, and bringing together students from 65 different nationalities into one very intense postgraduate only experience in London, I do think also contributes to our success. We run an enhanced master's program here. It's a 240 credit rather than the typical UK 180 credit. I think that again is...
So that's a 2-year program?
It's a 2-year program. So that again, I think is all these aspects and elements are creating the kind of a rich ecosystem and a very, very kind of rich environment in which our students learn. And of course, they're only postgraduate and they're only art and design. And I do think size and focus helps. I remember reading an article about Caltech, and they were sort of saying that actually the success of Caltech is very much down to its scale. You know, people who'd worked at MIT and moved to Caltech and then vice versa. So the ability and opportunity to kind of sit and meet somebody from a completely different field over a cup of coffee in Caltech was just part of day-to-day life. And that's true of the RCA too. I think because we're so small, you can meet.
So you have jewelry designers bumping into architects, bumping into painters, and sharing conversation.
Absolutely. And the way that we configure the workshops, the way we kind of, should we say, passport the workshops, is very deliberately aimed at allowing a sculptor into a 3D printing suite and allowing a jeweler into a sculptor's foundry. So people are playing with scale, they're playing with different materials, they're playing with completely different assumptions about design or art.
So we'll come back to assumptions and this idea of what are the assumptions with which we look at the world and how individual artists look at the world through their particular lens. But just in terms of the mission and the vision of the RCA, would you say that the students are as involved in creating that? Is that a dynamic mission and vision, or is that something that has been sort of historically set and you're continuing to to strive for that vision and to implement that mission?
I think there are certain kind of core principles that are like any organisation, are values that are sort of, should we say, non-negotiable, and that they're the values that are relevant today as they probably were in the 1950s. And then I think there are things that when you start talking to students, and let's face it, they are absolutely at the cutting edge of thinking in the field. You have to be informed and steered and guided and led in some ways by the expectations, the preoccupations of that generation, because they are really going to be sorting out some of the major challenges that we're facing. And I think if we were to say, no, this is a master-pupil relationship, with a 28-year-old postgraduate student would be a little conceited of us.
How influential do you think the arts are, whether it's visual arts, literature, architecture, performing arts, in influencing the thinking about the ethical questions of our day?
I think they're absolutely key. I think they're absolutely key. I think that it is the artists, it is the creative arts, it is the humanities that are holding a mirror up to us as a society, showing us our past, showing us our potential future, commenting and reflecting upon our nature. And I think that they are absolutely fundamental.
And is there anything you as an institution do, or that your wonderful teachers and students do to, in particular, make their voice heard by the people who are making decisions that are affecting the way the world is going? For example, scientists, or I know that you have students who work in design who, for example, might end up at a place like Apple. So how might they try to influence future employers or even governments or other organizations in terms of how they're making the decisions about major ethical issues?
I don't think anybody at the RCA who comes to the RCA gets accepted here has any desire to do anything other than influence society. I mean, something like 43% of our students go on to set up their own businesses. So these are people who are leaders, and they're not here, I think, just to kind of conform. And some people would sort of say, well, what are you teaching your students, at the moment? And we've sort of always come back to this idea. It's really about creative leadership. We are not interested in creating people who are going to do anything less than paradigm shift. And the fact that there are more RCA graduates at Apple than any other art and design university in the world, I think is testament to that. People like RCA graduates because they know that they are contrarian, they are lateral thinkers, they don't accept the status quo. And I'm not saying that we kind of actively, provocatively encourage them to sort of break rules like that, but what we do allow them to do is give them the freedom to experiment and explore during the time here.
Well, I think in your last couple of comments, you've touched on what I think is one of the most compelling definitions of leadership, which is starting from a place of principle, and in your particular case, giving them the benefit of historically defined and proven principles, and applying them to the issues of the day. And looking forward at the same time. Just in terms of individual artists, what do you think, whether it's RCA-connected artists or not, what do you think the ethical responsibility of artists is in today's world? Do artists have an ethical responsibility, or should they just be expressing themselves through their arts and whatever happens, happens?
I think they should be expressing themselves.
Okay.
And I think that they inevitably will be expressing an ethical standpoint. Whether they know it or not, whether they choose to or not, there is inevitably in any single sort of act, any sort of human act like that, I think there is an ethical position or an ethical questioning. It doesn't have to be, certainly shouldn't probably be the starting point, but it's inevitable that will, because we're human beings and we're looking for signs and signals and indicators and choices that have and haven't been made in anything in life. We're picking up those signals, and so an artist is sending out some signal of some kind. There is some statement always there.
So even something that might start out as a project to create something that's just beautiful, and I shouldn't say just beautiful, but to create a beautiful work somewhere that will be a reflection of even a question like, what is beauty in 2016?
I think so. I think so. Absolutely. I mean, I think, you can start off with an artist like Ai Weiwei who can take, life jackets from refugees cast on a Greek beach. He's obviously starting with a very, very kind of ethically and moral questioning in the creation of that piece, and it's there from sort of A to Z.
Right.
In the creation, the display, and our understanding and appreciation of it, it's extremely overt. And an artist like Ai Weiwei, I think, is at one extreme. And as you say, there are people who create things that are just beautiful. Well, there's something about the sublime and the transcendental that I think we would say has an ethical or a moral tone to it.
I love this word transcendental, because much of these conversations is about trying to understand the limits of humanity in today's world, where science, for example, design or genetics, or artificial intelligence, machine learning, sort of pushing the boundaries of humanities. And the arts helps us to say, wow, that's human, or maybe that's trying to be even something more. Where do you look for inspiration for your own ethical principles? Is it, would you say, from family, from religion, from somewhere in society, from RCA values, from artists? How do you find your true north?
Trying to think about how do I find my true north. I'm surprised that I'm going to say this, because I'm not a religious person, but I don't think you can do that much better than Jesus's parables, actually. I think, that's a very kind of old-fashioned, and I'm surprised that I'm saying it, but there is actually something about, I think, some of the New Testament teaching that is pretty extraordinary.
So that's interesting, because it's from some religious foundation, even if it's not necessarily a religion to which you're committed in terms of faith.
Absolutely,
And it's also from family.
Yeah. But then I would say, okay, so that's sort of what you sort of pick up before the age of 7, let's say. I mean, then now I would say it is the arts. I mean, particularly literature. I mean, I think that if you were to say to me, what book have you read most recently that poses to you the kind of the major ethical issues at the moment? It's Voices from Chernobyl by Svetlana Alexievich.
Okay.
And I think that book just says it all, actually, in terms of our responsibility or the responsibility of political leaders.
There's been a lot of tremendous literature recently that has tackled issues of the day, but also issues through history. North Korea, has shown up in a couple of prize-winning books, the Man Booker Prize about a year ago, and Pulitzer Prize about a year or two ago also. So it's interesting that you're looking also to literature, to other arts that aren't necessarily part of the curriculum here. How do you think ethics factor into your own work? You have a wonderful reputation as an excellent institutional leader. And someone who can handle all of the financial aspects, the management aspects, in addition to keeping an eye on making sure that the arts are flourishing and that you're, as you say, at the cutting edge of the education. But how does ethics factor into your thinking about your own position here?
In an educational institution where you are working in a community of academics and artists and designers, and you're working with what by my standards are young people. I mean, I think there has to be a very strong ethical,
by my standards too.
A strong kind of ethical compass. I mean, we are not in the business of trying to create people who are not value driven. I mean, everything that we're really trying to do here is create people who are value driven, and that's as true as a fashion designer as it is as an artist, because, is the RCA turning out a fashion designer who just wants to be famous or who just wants to go and work for a big brand? And what does that actually mean at the end of the day? I mean, what are the choices that our designers are being offered? And so at least if as long as they're given a sort of a good panoply of kind of offer, I think, by us as to these are the directions you could take with your career, these are the directions that you could take. I mean, I think that is a very strong responsibility.
And role models.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, who do we admire and who do we think actually is changing the world through design? Because we keep telling everybody,
Right.
and we strongly believe that design and art change the world. And it's really essential that we point to people who we feel actually are doing that.
Well, and you certainly have a renowned selection of alumni.
Yeah, we do, to choose from.
To choose from. Yeah, so that's quite an extraordinary
Yeah.
history. Interesting that you are an academic institution, so one of your values has to be academic independence, academic freedom.
Yes.
And so your artists are working in an ethically structured institution, but as far as their own work, they have freedom to do, I imagine, and explore and research pretty much anything they'd like. And I imagine that that's also part of the ethos that your students are taking on, which is understanding what this intellectual freedom is as an artist or as an academic.
They absolutely are, and I think that also where there's potentially friction, I think is where an individual's ethics perhaps collide or don't chime with the ethics and values of another individual.
Right. Well, with 65 different countries represented
and
cultures.
And that's kind of perhaps where there is a kind of a potential, I suspect, for disagreement rather than kind of overt conflict.
What has been the most important ethical conundrum that you've faced as a leader?
Like most folk in the world of art or sport, there is that sort of that issue of is it better to boycott and to sanction, or is it better to kind of to be open and to embrace and to try and affect change through? I mean, I think we think very, very carefully about the relationships, governmental relationships we have with particular regimes around the world. But we try to be very, very clear that we do not single out an individual artist from with a particular passport, and assume that person is a representative of that government regime that we perhaps would not wish to, we would say was just not aligned to our values. So I think in all academic institutions, all of and business actually, we're all having to take those sort of decisions around who we work with and who we don't work with.
I think that's a fascinating example, and in particular, I imagine there are situations, and you mentioned Ai Weiwei. Ai Weiwei has certainly been in danger at different points and subject to immense government pressure at different points. I would imagine that there are points at which supporting an artist to express him or herself in an independent way, when steeped in a particular kind of regime, might also be part of that whole question. But that's a fascinating answer. What are the greatest ethical challenges you think society faces today? And what about that? Is there a particular aspect of that question that concerns you most?
What concerns me most is the fact that what we're doing now is really not so far removed from turning our eyes to those, ships that drifted around the Mediterranean with European Jews on it, looking for a safe harbour in the late 1930s. And that to me is just terrifying to think that, my God, how far have we not moved from those days? And I think that the idea that we're talking about, war refugees and economic refugees and climate change refugees, we, from a design perspective, have a massive responsibility because if you talk to some of those countries that have welcomed migrants, like Germany, like Sweden, I think there's a strong, everybody can admire the ethical and moral impulse to accept those refugees, but they need to quickly get the designers on board to make sure that those people are housed, schooled, that there's an infrastructure in place, because certainly if you speak to the most liberal-minded Germans and Swedes, they say, suddenly our village,
absolutely,
nobody
there
had
is a
thought
practical
about
aspect to the decision,
and that's where design comes in. And I think that designers, one of the big challenges that we face is going to be not only mass migration and mass urbanization. It's the kind of conflation of the two. It's how are we suddenly going to create these big cities fast enough to deal with with this, these migrant populations that are coming from rural areas. We're now talking about Chinese aging populations are now moving to the cities. It's not just the young folk looking for work, it's now the older populations are migrating to the city. How are their needs going to be accommodated? So
different types of migration, even internal, for example. China's the perfect example of that.
We've just done a project, our Helen Hamlin Centre, for design, which looks specifically at aging populations, has just done a project with Tsinghua University in Beijing, looking precisely at this issue of how do you meet the housing needs and social needs of people who are older and have lived.
And Tsinghua is a wonderful example of a very technologically focused institution. So joining the design and the arts with the technology.
Absolutely.
Two follow-up points on that. I mean, you certainly resonate with other major institutional leaders. For example, Ian Levine at Human Rights Watch, who has really warned about the fact that we are not looking at history. You know, but many are migrants and saying, I came here or my parents came here. And it's a very scary way that we're looking at these questions. But in terms of the design aspect, didn't you have a student, did I read properly that you had a student who did something for Syrian refugees that was wearable shelter? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
What's so great about it is when you look at that project and you see a photograph in the press, and it's been quite well publicized, you look at it and think, oh, that's a piece of work by a fashion student. It's actually an interior design student. And what she did, well, the group of three students, what they did was actually create, out of Tyvek, which is a very strong, cheap building material, they created a coat that you could wear while you are on the move, and very, very light. And then when you kind of reach that awful wall that says, no, you're not, you can't,
another inch.
Then suddenly you take the coat off and you pull it this way and that way, and suddenly creates a little shelter. It's such a clever idea.
Extraordinary.
It's such a clever idea.
Do you think you could name, and this is a difficult question for someone with your vast experience with the arts, but is there a particular artist, sort of writ large, could be an architect, could be a writer, who you think has made the most or one of the most significant contributions to ethical thinking through the arts?
Well, it's got to be Shakespeare, hasn't it? The Tempest, King Lear, then, you know, Coriolanus, Macbeth. I mean, here's
all kinds of lessons about behavior.
Absolutely, and Richard III.
What drives behavior, human emotion,
and trying to understand, you know, as one Victorian critic said, you know, what is motiveless malignancy? And Shakespeare, I think, you know, whether it's some of his most evil characters like Iago, what is it that drives motiveless malignancy? And it sort of comes on to Hannah Arendt's, you know, banality of evil. And yet here's somebody in the sort of, you know, 17th century talking about you know, that utter, there's just no motive for that sort of evil. And I think Shakespeare really shows that to us so well.
I think it's a fascinating example. And you raise two themes that indeed go through much of my own work, much of my own advisory work, but explain much of what we're seeing today, in my view, in ethical, how should we say it, ethical challenges. One is understanding what drives the behavior. So we tend to be very focused on particular behaviors, not nearly focused enough on what's driving them. So we might try to stamp out or implement a law that says, don't commit bribery. But until we understand what's driving the bribery, we're never actually going to eradicate it. So that's one thing. But also, you mentioned Hannah Arendt and banality. Particularly with social media, we seem to be at a place where so quickly things become banal. And if you think back a year or so ago when we saw beheadings, it was unbelievably shocking that something like that could appear in social media. And very quickly, the word beheading almost became banal. And it's horrifying that certain degrees of unethical behavior and certain scale of unethical behavior, whether it's in financial institutions or elsewhere, can become unethical. And I think the migration question is a question of, is the public jaded?
How did we ever get to the state where, you know, a beheading was put on YouTube?
Exactly.
I mean, how did that world come about? It is absolutely shocking and terrifying to think that something that we thought, you know, we'd left behind in the Middle Ages, you know, putting heads on pikes is suddenly, you know, that's what we sort of thought about as kind of schoolgirls and schoolboys when we read the Tudors. And here we are in kind of, you know, industrialized, post-industrialized Western Europe and the States, hearing about American journalists who've been beheaded.
No, absolutely.
I mean, it's just shocking.
And actually, this whole relationship between social media and this idea of banality comes back to something you said earlier about your students and values and, for example, celebrity. And clearly this generation has to think about your values, your institutional, long-standing institutional values in a social media world. If you were going to recommend one or two works to political leaders, let's take, for example, I'm American, so let's take at this particular juncture Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. If you'd like them to learn a lesson or two in our ethically challenged US presidential election, what would you recommend they look at? Is there a painting? Is there a play they should see? Is there a building they should consider?
Well, I'm going to try and forget what I think they might or might not accept from me as bedtime reading.
Right. Okay.
Or that invitation to an exhibition, because I'm not sure that either of them would accept my choice.
Fair point.
But let's assume that they were completely open and completely up for it. I would like a political leader to look at the paintings of Anselm Kiefer, the novels of Patrick Modiano, a French writer, and I suppose again I keep coming back.
Recent Nobel Prize.
Yeah, I keep coming back to this sort of, I suppose the nearest ethical dilemma in our lifetimes, which is the Holocaust. And you know, I mean, how do we try to understand that? And I think that the kind of the issues of complicity, compliance, collaboration, cutting oneself off. I mean, all those sort of themes are explored in Patrick Modiano's work, and I think in Anselm Kiefer's as well, to an extent. I think.
So, for those who are not familiar with Kiefer, tell us just quickly, sort of, 2 sentences about Kiefer and style and
just I mean, I think Donald Trump would find him a bit too kind of stern, grey, depressing. But I think that for those people who are interested in I suppose, guilt. I mean, it's the guilt of a nation, the guilt of a generation. Looking at looking at Germany in the 1950s, the 1960s. You know, what is it? What did it mean to be German with that legacy? And how does one live with that sort of legacy of guilt and all the biblical associations of guilt.
It's interesting. I read something recently about Elie Wiesel, who, as you know, recently passed away, who said at one point he hadn't realized that it could be as hard to have that legacy in a way, or perhaps not as hard, but difficult to have that legacy as much to have suffered as a victim of the Holocaust. And your comments are particularly interesting because there are a number of comments you've made in the press over the years about, in your institutions, whether it's Hugh or Cooper Hewitt, linking history with contemporary.
Yeah.
And I think indeed the lessons from the Holocaust, and even to the point about US presidential elections, what the US presidents at the time did or didn't do, complicity, looking the other way.
Yeah. How did Srebrenica happen?
Yeah.
I mean, I cannot believe that I watched the television,
right?
As a sort of an adult, and saw that weekend in Srebrenica. I still cannot believe that I watched.
And it's very difficult to believe that post Rwanda, where we actually had a highly respected U.S. president apologize for failure to act, that we're then not very long afterwards seeing what's happening in Syria.
But I think that we've now got into, and I think, a mood of whether it's sort of American isolationism or, we kind of went marching into sort of bomb Iraq and bomb Syria and et cetera, et cetera. I think we've now sort of said, well, we've got to leave it to the locals on the ground. We shouldn't get involved. And I think that is almost as dangerous as marching in. Right. I think it's an incredibly difficult thing to do because we know what's happening in Syria is basically, it's a sort of third world war by proxy. And I think we can't just kind of march in. But how can we just turn around and say, oh, well, there's always going to be these kind of ethnic tensions between the Sunnis and the Shias, and this goes back many, many years. I mean, history can be used as a bit of an excuse for inaction.
Absolutely.
And I find that very irritating when you see the sort of older statesmen are turning around and reminding us of the history of the British in Mosul and Winston Churchill in Iraq, and these things have always it somehow condones or lets us all off the hook. And
back to banality also. let's turn to education, since you're an expert. Today on the news, we heard that the new Prime Minister in the UK, Theresa May, is putting forth a proposal to allow the opening of new grammar schools.
Yes.
A major change in British educational policy.
Yes.
I've spoken with other arts leaders who say they're absolutely terrified by the fact that in an exam-structured society, in particular at secondary school level, we're dismissing the arts, we're dismissing creativity.
Yes.
Maybe computer science is taking a stronger place,
Yeah.
but all of a sudden the arts are being relegated to sort of second tier in many ways, in terms of how important they seem to career success, in terms of allocation of budget, in terms of priorities for studying and course allocation, time in school. What role should the arts be playing in education today?
Oh, gosh, how long have we got?
As long as you'd like.
I mean, I think that there are some terrible assumptions made about the arts in the school curriculum by politicians who actually all studied, history at university. So they really should know better.
Exactly.
And I think that this idea that you should kind of bifurcate a population at the age of 11. I mean, I know that the Secretary of State and Prime Minister have said this is going to be a 21st century grammar school. Well, if it is, can we please drop the word grammar? Because the word grammar instantly sends a signal of really kind of a 19th century kind of German system.
Right.
I do think it's a huge shame that politicians have to keep playing around with our health service and our education service. I don't think they're experts in the field. I do think, I don't agree with the the dismissal of experts. I think experts do have a place in education, and there is an evidence base to suggest when and how one selects and how one educates. I think it's awful to think of the arts as the sort of for the less able, the sort of route that you go down because you're less able.
And maths or English or
it's just so dispiriting, because the idea that if you're a fantastic physicist you shouldn't be doing A-level music, that's absolutely what we should be encouraging. And I think that if you go to somewhere like Imperial College and you look at the way that they have a undergraduate degree which is for music and physics, and they're in conjunction with the Royal College of Music, absolutely, that is where the future lies. That is also, to me, that is the sign of a super valuable, intelligent, gifted individual. I mean, I would love to spend time with somebody who's doing physics and violin.
And that's a particular issue with some of the European educational systems, and indeed in the UK, whereas in the US, one goes to 4-year undergraduate programs, can decide on a major after arriving. So it isn't, I'm going to University X to read English. It's, I'm going to this university and I'll see what I think when I get there. And there are also quite a range of diversity requirements. So even an English major will have to take sciences and will have to take social sciences. And also there's even room for a double degree. So I think, I hope the systems evolve, because certainly the idea of being able to look at things from different perspectives and also testing the boundaries of one's strengths and weaknesses. Because at 11 years old, it's very hard to know if you really are good or not so good at maths.
Absolutely. I mean, I think it's far too early a stage, and I think that one can I mean, my personal view, not my institutional view, but my personal view is one can kind of gently select and tier and stream and amongst a community, but I think suddenly taking certain people off down the corridor and taking them to another school and other people to another, I mean, I just don't think it's, I just don't see the value of it.
And presumably if they're all going to engage in problem solving and in creating a thriving, ethical, productive, happy society, we each need to know enough about each other's disciplines to be able to work with each other and to be able to put heads together to solve problems. And backgrounds, exactly.
People have got to know, they've got to be mixing with people from different backgrounds. And I think that diversity, cultural, cognitive diversity actually is quite important.
Absolutely.
Certainly, I bet when you build a team, you're looking for cognitive as well as cultural diversity, because you know that those teams are going to be the best.
So as we come to the end of our discussion, a couple final questions. What excites you the most about the point where we are in history in terms of the link between science, technology, and the arts and design?
What excites me is I think that those of those of us on the art side of the fence, and it shouldn't really be a fence, but let's assume it's there.
Okay.
I think that we are much more open and interested and willing to engage and explore with a synthetic biologist or with an artificial intelligence computer scientist. I think we're very intrigued at the moment, and that to me I think is fantastic. Also, I think of the kind of the receptivity that we get from some of the scientists at universities and around the world, but here in London. I mean, they are very respectful and very interested in something that isn't just a sort of secondary partnership. You know, the artists are coming in to kind of explain or to visualize our work. That's of no interest really to an artist. An artist wants to actually be an equal partner in a research project, and I think that a lot of the scientists that we now talk to are very genuinely interested. They recognize that actually that invention will just sit on a lab table unless a designer comes along and looks at it and says, you know what, that actually has got a market need. I can identify how you could create a market for that invention, for that experiment that actually is quite different from perhaps what you thought. Or
perhaps even a delivery system that isn't what.
Absolutely.
But you mentioned market, and I have to say it is most impressive here how much stiff competition you're giving some of your peer institutions when it comes to offering opportunities for entrepreneurship. So could we touch a little bit on how important the entrepreneurial spirit is here, including to the ethics questions, that you actually get some of this wonderful work out there?
I mean, I think for us, you know, we are here to help support the individual student, but actually in our Royal Charter, we are there to also, you know, serve industry and to help industry. So we're very, very mindful of the fact that, you know, if we've got a young entrepreneur, how can we help, you know, him or her actually take an idea? Because there's nothing more exciting than watching a really cussed, creative individual just push and fight with that kind of determination to actually create a startup, and then to see those first steps once they've got their early investment. And I think that for us, you know, creativity isn't just about you know, the wonderful idea to begin with, the light bulb. It's also about helping create that company, and that it's wonderful when I go to look at small companies in in London that are stuffed full of RCAers. And they only graduated, you know, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and you see that they're employing about 40 staff from the RCA. It's just so heartwarming to sort of see that entrepreneurship.
Well, it certainly has become part of your identity and your ethos. To connect with government needs, to connect with business needs, to connect with scientists' needs, technologists' needs. It's truly extraordinary. What would you like to say that I haven't asked you, and in particular on these thorny questions about artists and ethics?
I suppose the only thing I would add is in terms of the cost of education. I think we've got to be incredibly, you know, we talk about selection, the latest thoughts around grammar schools, but I think it's extremely important that we can always ensure that the best and the brightest can come to university, and that it isn't just a place for people who can pay. I think that's extremely important. You know, we're changing our university system, and as it changes, it has to recognise that, you know, the scholarship and the financial aid systems have got to be put in place. And I would not want to see the student loan book somehow start to kind of ramp up the interest rates, lower the threshold of repayment, all the sort of tricks of the trade that you can sort of imagine would be in place. I mean, at the moment, it is quite a benign system, particularly compared to the loan system in the US. And I would want to see it remain absolutely benign and more benign, so that people do get, you know, the opportunity to kind of have a loan holiday if they have a baby, if their salary drops below a certain level. You know, I think it's really critical that.
Well, you're winding up the conversation on one of the most fundamental ethical challenges of our time, which is inequality. And certainly if education is the pathway to social mobility, then equality in terms of educational opportunity is critical. So thank you for that. Paul, it's really been an honor and a pleasure.
Well, thank you.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
time. Very
Good.
grateful.